Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to America. It's our great pleasure to have you all here today. We very much appreciate you taking the time to come and join us in this celebration. Today, this event is probably our first big public event to celebrate what is going to be a year of celebrations all around 70 years of diplomatic relations between the United States and Indonesia, about the friendship, the official friendship that we have developed between Indonesians and Americans. Obviously, US, Americans, and Indonesians have had relationships long before that. There's been commerce and people trading. But this is the 70 years of official relationships between a secure, independent Indonesia and the United States. And that 70 years has been very bountiful and fruitful for both our countries and has brought a lot of benefits to both of us. And we are really looking forward over this next year to look at that 70 years, think about all that we've achieved, and think about what we can achieve in the next 70 years. The motto, the motto that we're using to celebrate this 70 years is celebrating diversity, prosperity, and partnership. And this, we think, covers the three significant areas of that relationship between Indonesia and the United States. And this event is probably really a great way to start talking about that relationship, because there's no better place to start that conversation than is really at the beginning. And we're very happy today, we're very proud today to have with us the eminent professor from the United States, a specialist in this period of history in Indonesia specifically. He wrote a book in 1981 all about the US relationship with Indonesia and its role in helping to secure Indonesia's independence from Holland. Professor McMahon is distinguished Professor Emeritus from Ohio State University. He also taught in Florida and Virginia before going to Ohio. And we're very pleased to have him here to speak to you all about this topic. I'd also like to point out that we're also going to have another historical conversation, if you're interested in history, about Indonesia's place and role in World War II on the 26th of this month at 1:30. So I hope if you're interested in history, I hope you come back here to listen to that program as well. It's another part of our 7th anniversary program. The program will, the At America's program around 7th years of anniversary is not just going to be all historical. We're also going to be doing programs about the future, about the collaborations that we hope to inspire going forward, and also talk about what we're currently doing and the kinds of successes we're seeing occurring here in Indonesia. I would be remiss not to thank our colleagues and partners, USINDO, who has reached out to many of you and has been a constant partner of ours in this conversation around Indonesia-US relations and what's important to move our countries forward, to strive for that better world that we all know is just outside, just within our grasp. So I want to thank you all again for being here. Thank our partners. Thank Professor McMahon, and hope you all enjoy today's conversation.
Thank you, Pak Jet, for the warm welcome. And now I would like to invite our moderator for today, Ibu Susi Sudarman, Director American Studies Center at University of Indonesia and USINDO Advisor.
Right-hand side? Right-hand side, right? No, right-hand side or left-hand side? Hello, friends. Is it working? Oh, it's working. Okay, thank you. Welcome. I'm not a historian. I'm a political scientist. But my friends, good friends, are historians. Two are here from Wisconsin, apart from Professor McMahon. We are very fortunate, distinguished guests, ambassadors, professors, lecturers, and students. We have Professor Robert McMahon, Emeritus Professor of History, who will deliver a general lecture entitled The Role of the United States in Securing Indonesian Independence, 1945-1949, History, Legacy, and Lessons. I've read his book, but this is the first time that I get to meet him personally. It's an interesting book. This is the only book, perhaps, on that, apart from an MA thesis of someone who did the same thing on Indonesia's independence. I welcome Professor McMahon to come and join us here. Welcome. Yeah. Hold the microphone, or?
I'm going to stand.
You can stand.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming out. I know everybody knows the date, August 17th, 1945, rightly celebrated as a holiday. Just out of curiosity, for how many does the date December 27th, 1949 stand out as a milestone? I spoke to a group of students yesterday, there were about 100 of them, and I don't think a single one recognized the date December 27th, 1949. So I'm going to start with that. On that date, at a solemn, moving, yet restrained ceremony held at a historic auditorium in the 17th century Royal Palace in Amsterdam, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands signed the papers that formally transferred sovereignty over the territory the Dutch had called the East Indies to the independent government of Indonesia. On behalf of the newly independent government of Indonesia, Prime Minister Muhammad Hatta signed those papers. And a simultaneous ceremony took place right here in Jakarta, more than 8,000 miles away, in which the Indonesian Deputy Prime Minister, Sultan Hamengkubuwono, and the Dutch High Commissioner solemnly signed an identical copy of what they called the Protocol of Transfer. A crowd of more than 20,000 gathered in what is now Merdeka Square, and they cheered vociferously as the Dutch tricolor flag was hauled down for the last time, and the Indonesian national anthem was played as the red and white Indonesian flag, the symbol of the Republic, was hoisted up in its place. When that moment occurred, richly symbolic, the assembled crowd was driven into a frenzy. Now, you might know that that Indonesian flag and the singing of the national anthem was prohibited under Dutch colonial rule and during the 4 years of struggle between World War II and the events that I just described. If you sang the Indonesian national anthem or waved the Indonesian flag, you ran the risk of being jailed by the Dutch authorities. And so when that emotional moment occurred, and there are lots of Indonesians today over the age, from the mid-70s into their 80s and 90s who probably remember those events indelibly. Although in a predominantly young country, most people haven't studied this in school and certainly have no personal recollection of it. But the real Indonesian celebration didn't take place until the next day, December 28th. That's when Sukarno, the man who had come to personify the Indonesian independence movement, triumphantly returned to Jakarta. Driven by from the capital by the Dutch 4 years earlier, Sukarno was now coming back to take up residence in the former palace of the Dutch governors as the first president of an independent Indonesia. When he landed in his freshly painted red and white Dakota airplane, and he landed at the airport, he drove 4 miles to what is now Merdeka Square, and the highway was lined on both sides with cheering throngs of Indonesians greeting their about-to-be sworn-in new president and the man who had come to personify the whole cause of Indonesian independence. A crowd of 200,000 jammed into Merdeka Square, then called Koningsplein Square, facing the palace, as Sukarno gave a stirring 5-minute speech. And of course, he was a great orator. He ended his address with the cry, Sekali Merdeka, freedom forever. One foreign diplomat, gesturing toward the vast crowds, remarked to a colleague, could the Dutch ever have held this in the face of that? Although it is less remembered today than it should be, the United States played a major, even a decisive role in helping the Indonesians to secure independence. Since American support was essential for the continuance of the Netherlands' rule over the archipelago, once that support was withdrawn, as it was in the spring of 1949, the Dutch position became untenable and unsustainable. To assume that American policy toward the Indonesian Revolution must have been motivated by Washington's historic opposition to colonialism and support for self-determination, however, would grossly misrepresent the American record in the East Indies during the immediate post-World War II years. Quite to the contrary, until the final stage of the bitter and bloody Dutch-Indonesian struggle over who would rule the Indonesian islands, American authorities habitually sided with the Dutch, believing that the support of a European ally was more dependable and more useful to U.S. Cold War strategy than that of a group of untested Asian nationalists. Only after the Second Dutch military offensive that commenced in December 1948 did American policymakers begin to shift their allegiance. And even then, Washington moved haltingly and often reluctantly, motivated less by idealism or altruism than by more tangible factors: the weight of domestic and international opinion, concern for the viability of the United Nations, careful calculation of broader Cold War interests, and not least, the strength of a vigorous Indonesian guerrilla resistance that had thwarted all Dutch efforts to pacify the islands and that exposed The Hague's policy as an abject failure. It was only then, when the Dutch themselves appeared to be the greatest threat to stability and order in Indonesia, and in the process threatened to endanger high-priority policies and appropriations related both to the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that the United States placed its power and prestige behind the Republican nationalists. That policy shift paved the way for the simultaneous ceremonies in Amsterdam and Jakarta 70 years ago that marked the birth of a new nation. During World War II, American attitudes and policies toward the status and future of the Netherlands East Indies became subsumed under the broader problem of how to deal with colonial territories. That problem was particularly acute in territories such as the Indies that had been conquered and occupied by the Japanese during the early stage of World War II. Throughout the war years, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his top associates proclaimed repeatedly that the United States stood for self-determination and for the progressive evolution of dependent peoples toward self-government. Nationalists in the Indies and elsewhere heard those words, cheered those words, and saw the United States as a potential, even a likely ally in their bids for independence from their colonial overlords. In August 1941, FDR and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill signed the famous Atlantic Charter, which called for the right of all people to form the government under which they will live. And as if to clear up any ambiguity about the applicability of that charter, in a radio address to the American people in February 1942, Roosevelt declared that the Atlantic Charter not only applies to the parts of the world that border on the Atlantic, but to the whole world. In a speech in May of 1942 on America's Memorial Day, Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles declared that the war should ensure the sovereign equality of all peoples and should be followed by the liberation of all people. He emphasized the age of imperialism is ended. The right of people to their freedom must be recognized as the civilized world long since recognized the rights of an individual to his personal freedom. The principles of the Atlantic Charter, he continued, must be guaranteed to the world in all oceans and in all continents. When British troops landed in Java in September 1945, 6 weeks after Indonesia's declaration of independence, they found scrawled on the walls of public buildings statements such as, "We're fighting for government for the people, by the people, and of the people. We're fighting for our inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And give us liberty or give us death." One British officer grumbled at the time, "Your damned American Revolution is still giving us trouble." Yet despite the avowed principles of the Atlantic Charter and the Charter of the United Nations of 1945, and despite the repeated proclamations of President Roosevelt and other senior administration spokesmen during the war, the United States never actually pursued an anti-colonial policy toward the Netherlands East Indies. American attachment to the hallowed principles of self-determination remained largely rhetorical. Such sentiments were never translated into substantive policy. The retreat from these anti-colonial statements began as early as 1944 and can best be explained by the confluence of several factors. First, post-war planning anticipated the need for close cooperation with the European nations, the major imperial powers. Active encouragement of native self-rule would have interjected a potentially inflammatory element into American-European relations, thereby threatening that fundamental American policy objective. British Prime Minister Churchill, the unofficial spokesman for the imperial powers, expressed his unalterable opposition to American meddling in colonial affairs on several occasions, and U.S. leaders, mindful of the need for harmonious post-war relations, chose not to press the issue. In addition, the War and Navy departments were intent on securing American bases in the Pacific, and they overrode all State Department proposals for some form of comprehensive tutelatory or trusteeship program. Finally, and I think most significantly, American authorities never equated the principles of anti-colonialism and support, never equated the principles of anti-colonialism with support for the early and dramatic independence of all colonized peoples. On the contrary, American policymakers unanimously clung to the view that the dependent areas of the world would be prepared to act as responsible members of the global family of nations only after an appropriate period of preparation or tutelage under the guidance of their respective mother countries. Native self-government was a distant goal in the view of US officials, not an immediate prospect. The American devotion to self-determination then was sharply limited. Washington favored gradual evolutionary changes in what it believed to be a hopelessly outdated imperial system. It certainly did not favor or anticipate revolutionary change. So American policy toward the Netherlands East Indies, the islands that became Indonesia, must be understood within this larger context. Toward the end of the Pacific War, American diplomats repeatedly reassured Dutch officials that the United States did not and would not question to their ability to reassert their rights as the territorial sovereign over the Indonesian islands. At the same time, those diplomats hoped that Dutch imperial rule would be liberalized so as to eliminate its most exclusionary and exploitative features. The need to cooperate with The Hague in post-war Europe, however, effectively blunted that reforming zeal and prevented the State Department from translating such vague sentiments into substantive policy. The emergence of a broad-based nationalist movement in Indonesia, capped by the proclamation of the Republic of Indonesia on August 17, 1945, in the immediate wake of Japan's formal surrender, further complicated the American dilemma. Unwilling to countenance support for an untested and inexperienced nationalist regime, especially one under the fiery leadership of Sukarno, a man who the Dutch reminded the Americans had cooperated and collaborated with the Japanese during the Pacific War, Washington gravitated more and more toward a pro-Dutch position. After all, American officials had advocated the reform of the imperial system, not its immediate destruction. They'd pressed for gradual evolutionary changes, not abrupt revolutionary ones. Americans assumed that European influence and control, while it should be limited, would and should continue in the developing world. By challenging the reassertion of Western hegemony, as the Indonesian nationalists had done and Vietnamese nationalists had done at exactly the same time, Asian nationalists were thus threatening the very foundation of American plans for a new order in East Asia. Given the perspective of 1945, the immediate aftermath of World War II, it's probably difficult to imagine the United States pursuing a different policy. The Dutch were trusted allies who had ruled the East Indies for centuries. While the United States had traditionally objected to the excesses of the imperialist system and the closed trading barriers which had prevented American business and American capital from operating in the Indies on a fair and equitable basis, the United States also recognized and applauded the stability and order that the European colonial powers had brought to the developing world. Faced with a choice between a native government of revolutionary nationalists and a return to Dutch control over the archipelago, the United States, not surprisingly, chose to support the Netherlands. Still, the United States didn't completely disavow its identification with the principles and precepts of anti-colonialism. Instead, the United States sought to sidestep the dilemma of whether to support the force of anti-colonial nationalism or European imperialism by proclaiming a stance of strict neutrality. But the resulting policy was distorted and contradictory. While declaring its strict impartiality toward the growing rift between the Dutch and the Indonesians in the months that followed Sukarno's proclamation of independence, Washington consistently bolstered the position of its European ally. As Asian expert and US ambassador to the Netherlands, Stanley Hornbeck, astutely observed, we in effect attempted to support neither side and yet favored one and hoped not unduly to offend the other. An early indication of this attitude was revealed by the American government's stance toward the question of lend-lease supplies. World War II surplus property and military equipment under the lend-lease program was freely provided to the Dutch. The Dutch used some of this very American equipment, including arms, to suppress Indonesian nationalists. Sukarno personally appealed to the American government to withdraw that lend-lease material in letters that he sent to President Harry Truman in the fall of 1945. And the United States responded by ordering that the insignia on all that equipment be removed promptly. But the equipment was not withdrawn, just the made in USA insignias. Official American sympathy for the Dutch position was revealed in a formal policy statement released by the US State Department, in which it proclaimed its neutrality while recognizing the right of the Netherlands to rule Indonesia as the territorial sovereign. This was a severe blow to the young nationalist regime, which had been hopeful that America's wartime anti-colonial pronouncements would presage an American policy of support for Indonesian independence. Obviously, that didn't happen. When Sukarno appealed to the United States to assume the role of an impartial arbitrator in the Dutch-Indonesian dispute, his request was summarily rejected. In rejecting it, then Secretary of State James Burns said such a request could be honored only if it came from the territorial sovereign. Indonesia's leaders were disheartened, and they quickly learned that American neutrality had a distinctly non-neutral flavor. By the end of 1945, then, the United States was pursuing a policy that represented a virtual repudiation of the high-sounding principles articulated in the Atlantic Charter and in so many wartime speeches. The dominant viewpoint within the State Department and throughout the government was that the need to maintain Western solidarity obviated any secondary interest in mounting a crusade to reform European colonialism. At first, Washington tried to achieve this objective by remaining neutral and uninvolved, but this was hardly a viable policy for the world's leading power. It was hard to remain a passive observer, especially when the dispute threatened to escalate into all-out warfare. Gradually, then, the United States began to exert its considerable influence on the Dutch and the Indonesian Republicans, first through unilateral pressure, and then beginning in mid-1947 through its membership on the UN Security Council's Good Offices Committee. In November 1946, the Dutch and Indonesians reached an interim agreement signed at Linggadjati and called the Linggadjati Agreement. That agreement gave the British the opportunity to finally withdraw their troops from the Indies, as they did a mere matter of weeks after the signing of this agreement. Linggadjati didn't solve all the problems, and the Republican nationalists were forced to make several critical concessions, but they were heartened by the fact that a formal agreement had been put into practice, and they were hopeful that it would be implemented in a fair and impartial manner. When it was not implemented in a fair, impartial manner, and when the Dutch used their gathering military strength in the East Indies to resort to force of arms to solve their problems, with the first military offensive or police action that was launched in July 1947, a series of major debates erupted at the Security Council of the United Nations. The United States tried to play a compromise role. It sought to water down those resolutions offered by sympathetic countries like India that were calling for compulsory arbitration. Instead, a weaker solution was put forward and accepted by the Security Council that a three-nation Good Offices Committee would be established not to arbitrate the Dutch-Indonesian dispute, but simply to offer suggestions, offer recommendations. And those recommendations could only be offered if each of the two parties agreed to accept them. So it was the weakest of all imaginable mediation committees. And yet, President Truman appointed a remarkable individual, Frank Porter Graham, the president of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, an individual who had some experience as a labor arbitrator, who was a professor of American history before he became an academic administrator, but a person who knew virtually nothing about Indonesia, had never been to Indonesia or any other part of Asia at that point, and had zero diplomatic experience. But Graham came to Indonesia and gave his role as a mediator his best possible shot. His strengths were that he was a fair-minded individual. He was a quick study. He very quickly figured out what was happening in the Indies, and he gained strong trust on the part of the Indonesian nationalist leadership. He established a very warm rapport with the key Indonesian leaders. When negotiations began to falter once again in December of 1947, he offered a set of counter-proposals called the Christmas proposals because they were offered on Christmas Day. And these were a set of proposals which most Indonesians thought were largely favorable to the Dutch, because they were. But Graham urged his Indonesian friends to support them because he argued this was the best way to avert a Dutch military offensive, which might well prove devastating to the Indonesian Republic. Now, when I say the Indonesian Republic, I refer to those parts of Java and Sumatra that were under control of the republic proclaimed by Sukarno and Hatta in August of 1945. And at that time, and it's probably roughly comparable today, the population of Java and Sumatra represented about 85% of the total population of the Indonesian islands. What the Dutch sought to do is to create a federated Indonesian structure, a federal structure, as they called it, in which the Republic of Indonesia, even though it had de facto control over the two most significant islands that had the bulk of the population, that would be one of only 3 Indonesian entities. Another would be East Indonesian, most of the outer islands, and the third would be Borneo. And what the Dutch were seeking to do was to find cooperative, pliable Indonesian leaders. Cynics at the time referred to them as Dutch puppets, who would balance out the strength of the Republic and create a federal structure under Dutch control in which the Dutch would retain sovereignty over a long-term basis, and in which, and I'm summarizing, complicated negotiations and proposals here, so forgive me for that, but time is limited. And essentially, what the Dutch were saying is, we will grant you self-government, but we will control foreign affairs, defense, and all economic matters. Now, what kind of sovereignty is that? When I did a number of interviews when I was writing my book with former State Department officials, and one of them, who I quote at length in this book, a man named Charlton Ogborn, said that the first thing you realize when you get involved in one of these colonial disputes, as he put it, is that you can't slice sovereignty. One entity is going to be sovereign. You can't split it. It might be a kind of flip way to put it, but one can't be partially pregnant. A woman can't be part pregnant. She's either pregnant or she isn't pregnant. Now, in international affairs, sovereignty works in a similar way. One entity is going to be the sovereign, and one is going to be the subordinate party. And this was a core issue. Now, the Indonesians made critical compromises in order to create an agreement engineered by Frank Porter Graham that was called the Renville Agreement, and it was signed in January of 1948. Interestingly, it was signed on board and named after an American naval vessel, the USS Renville, which was docked in the Java Sea. The reason why Graham proposed the use of a naval vessel, a U.S. naval vessel, for negotiations is that the Dutch and Indonesians couldn't agree on where to meet. The Dutch wanted negotiations to take place in this city, the city they called Batavia, but the Indonesians didn't want to have negotiations on Dutch ground. The Indonesians wanted to negotiate in Jakarta, which was the capital at that point of their Republican government. The Dutch didn't want to go into Indonesian Republican territory, and voila, Graham came up with this magical solution. We won't meet in either side. We'll meet in neutral territory. A U.S. naval vessel docked in the harbor in the Java Sea. When the Indonesian Republicans were deeply divided on whether to accept this proposal or not, asked for Graham's advice, a man who they had really come to trust by this point. He said to them famously, and many Indonesians repeat this statement, he said to them, "You are what you are, and that is what you will remain." What he was saying with this statement is, yes, I'm asking you to give up a lot. I'm asking you to swallow a bitter pill. He was implying that he knew there was a strong degree of unfairness in the Dutch proposals, and that he understood that the Dutch had violated the previous agreement at Linggadjati. But he was saying, if you don't sign the agreement, there is a possibility that the Republic will be expunged at the force of arms. If you do sign the agreement, you will retain your moral authority and your broad-based political support as the most powerful and most broad-based representative of the Indonesian people and of the cause of Indonesian nationalism. The Indonesian Prime Minister at the time, Amir Sharifuddin, bowed to Graham's request and signed the agreement. He recognized that it was sufficiently unpopular domestically that it would probably make his position impossible going forward. And that's what happened. He was forced to resign as a result of the Renville Agreement. And he wrote at the time, "Tell the American people that we count upon them to ensure a fair plebiscite. The plebiscite will chart the future destiny of the people." Graham's compromise proposals had called for a free and fair vote throughout the Indonesian islands, allowing the Indonesian people to determine who would be their representative. The Dutch, not surprisingly, never moved to hold that plebiscite because they feared clearly that the results of that plebiscite would be favorable to the Republican government and unfavorable to their interests. Now, officially, in the aftermath of the Renville Agreement, the United States' position toward the Dutch-Indonesian struggle remained one of nominal neutrality. And American participation on the Good Offices Committee and the signing of the Renville Agreement bolstered Washington's image as an impartial and even-handed mediator. But American policies actually continued to work to the benefit of the Dutch. When the European Recovery Program was initiated in 1948, moreover, the United States was placed in the anomalous position of serving on a UN commission as a nominally impartial arbitrator, when in fact its financial assistance was at least indirectly making Holland's aggressive policy financially feasible. In short, Washington was helping to settle a dispute that it was actually funding. Talk about an embarrassing position to be in. And there were shrewd critics of American policy within the United States and outside the United States who pointed to that very contradiction. In fact, by the end of 1948, estimates determined that the United States was providing approximately $1 million per day to the Netherlands in economic assistance. And the Netherlands was spending approximately $1 million per day, the exact same amount, to prosecute its military actions in the Indonesian islands. So one did not have to be a PhD in mathematics to do the math here and figure out that without American Marshall Plan support, the Netherlands would have been financially unable to mount its military operations in Indonesia. The United States never pushed the Dutch too hard throughout the end of 1948 because it wanted to maintain warm, harmonious, and productive relationships with an important European ally. The European Recovery Program and the incipient Atlantic Pact, what became the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, necessitated the steadfast support of the Western European nations, including, of course, the Netherlands. And the intensification of the Cold War in 1948 just intensified that need. The acting Secretary of State, Robert Lovett, in an instruction that he cabled to Graham in Indonesia, made this very clear when he wrote, "The Netherlands is a strong component of US policy in Europe. The State Department believes that the stability of the present Dutch government would be seriously undermined if the Netherlands fails to retain very considerable stake in the Netherlands East Indies, and the political consequences of the failure of the present Dutch government would in all likelihood be prejudicial to the US position in Western Europe." Accordingly, Lovett concluded, "The department is unfavorable to any solution requiring immediate and complete withdrawal of the Netherlands from the Indies or any important part thereof." And that was the official Washington position. But an interesting pattern developed where while the higher level officials in Washington continued to tilt strongly toward the Dutch, those diplomats who were sent to Indonesia and had an opportunity to get a firsthand look at what was happening on the ground in this country came, like Graham, to sympathize with the Indonesian Republic. Graham was succeeded by a Foreign Service officer by the name of Court Du Bois, and he later conceded that the main reason why he was brought out of retirement to serve on this important UN negotiating committee was because his biases toward the Dutch were so well known. But Du Bois came out here and had a chance as a fair-minded person to assess what was happening and the positions of the different sides, and came, like Graham, to sympathize with the Indonesian Republicans. He thought they were moderate, cosmopolitan, likable even, open to Western investment and trade, and strongly anti-communist. All of the factors that appealed to American diplomats during the early Cold War period. He actually put forward a compromise proposal in an effort to head off what he thought would be another Dutch military offensive. And the Dutch took great offense at the actions of this man who had initially come to the Indies because he was so pro-Dutch. He was then replaced by Admiral Cochran, the man who became the first U.S. ambassador accredited to Indonesia. Cochran, too, came out with strongly pro-Dutch feelings. But after he was here for a short period of time, he followed the same pattern that had been followed by Graham and by Du Bois. He came to sympathize with the Indonesian Republic. He came to believe that the Dutch were acting in a heavy-handed fashion, that they were intransigent, that they were incorrigibly stubborn, and that they had really not psychologically accepted the reality of an independent Indonesia, that psychologically they had just not come to the point where they were willing to let go. A small nation of 9 million people saw its international prestige and status tied up with its control over an island, much richer in resources and much more populous. At that time, Indonesia had about 80 million people. The Dutch had 9 million. So Indonesia was more than 8 times more populous than Holland. Cochran is not able to prevent the Dutch from launching a military offensive. And their second military offensive, which commences in December of 1948, is even more heavy-handed than their first. They attack, without warning, Jakarta, the capital of the Indonesian Republic, and they put Sukarno and Hatta in their custody. They put them in jail, essentially. The 2 leaders of the republic that they're seeking to negotiate with, they put in jail. Frank Porter Graham, from his perch back at the University of North Carolina, viewed what was happening, and he drew an example from the American Revolution. He said it would be as if the British government locked up George Washington and then took Tories, the American loyalists during our revolution, who were loyal and sympathetic to Great Britain, put them in charge of several American states and magically called this the United States of America. And for anyone who understands, some of the basics about American history and the Revolutionary period, it's a powerful analogy. And it is comparable, I think, to what the Dutch were seeking to do. Ironically, it was primarily European rather than Asian considerations that proved to be the decisive factor in the American decision after the second military offensive to pressure the Dutch directly into granting independence to the Indonesians. As a result of Dutch intransigence in Indonesia, Congress placed substantial pressure on the Truman administration to move in that direction by threatening to cut off all funds to the Marshall Plan and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Those programs, remember, were at the very heart. That was the centerpiece of American Cold War foreign policy in 1949. They were far too important to be put in jeopardy by a colonial war in Indonesia, a contest, to be frank, that to most senior American policymakers was an annoying sideshow in the overall global state of play. In February of 1949, a Republican senator from Maine named Owen Brewster introduced a resolution signed by 9 other Republican senators which called for the suspension of all Marshall Plan aid and all other assistance to the Netherlands until it stopped its military action. It's a well-settled rule, he said, that he who pays the piper is entitled to call the tune. Speaking before the Senate on February 7th, 1949, Brewster termed the Dutch offensive murderous, a crushing sneak attack like Japan's on Pearl Harbor, like Nazi Germany's on Holland itself. He applauded the moderate character of the Republicans, who he said have fought off all radical tendencies and within the past year have suppressed by force of arms a small communist uprising. He was referring there to the so-called Median uprising, in which communist elements within the broader Indonesian nationalist movement mounted an effort to gain control through force of arms over the Indonesian independence movement. The Median rebellion was suppressed, and in suppressing it, the Republicans really testified to the authentic nature of their anti-communist character. And for Americans, this was a crucial litmus test that the Indonesians passed with flying colors, as it were, through their actions at Median. The other critical factor is what was actually happening on the ground. The Dutch gamble by resorting to military force, despite warnings from the United States not to do so, was based on a simple calculation that they could achieve military victory quickly, pacify the islands, and present the United States, the UN Commission, and the world with a fait accompli. They would have shown the world that this Indonesian Republican movement really wasn't a powerful force, and it had been suppressed and defeated quickly. So, in effect, deal with the results. Not unlike the way Russian President Putin acted in the Crimea, if you allow me to make a recent historical analogy. Putin took the view that we're going to take over the Crimea. There'll be a lot of shouting and complaining, but it'll soon be a fait accompli, and the world will deal with it, because the world will have to deal with it, because we will be in control. Not unlike Putin, the Dutch felt that they could finally, once and for all, stamp out this infuriating Indonesian Republican movement and regain control over the Indies and reestablish some of the prestige, that they had lost during the humiliation of the 4-year Nazi occupation that they had so recently suffered from. But they miscalculated. The Indonesian guerrilla forces, under the leadership of the legendary General Sudirman, proved to be a very powerful foe, far more powerful than the Dutch had calculated. The Dutch kept saying to the world that we're pacifying the islands, we're about to snuff out the last bit of resistance. But that wasn't the reality on the ground, and American military and diplomatic observers recognized it. In fact, by January and February of 1949, the Dutch were not on the offensive, they were on the defensive. Had the United States not intervened diplomatically, it's entirely possible that the Indonesians would have earned their independence through force of arms rather than through diplomatic concessions and negotiations. But that was not the path that was chosen by the Indonesian leadership going back to 1945. The path they consciously strove to follow was a path of moderation, reaching out to the West, and winning independence through diplomacy rather than through armed struggle. Well, on March 31st of 1949, with these various events coming to a head, the United States newly installed Secretary of State Dean Acheson has a climactic sit-down meeting with Dirk Sticker, the Dutch Foreign Secretary. Sticker was in Washington, as were the foreign ministers of most of the major Western European powers, as well as the Foreign Minister of Canada, because they were about to sign in a gala ceremony in Washington the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was set for April 4th. 4 days before NATO was signed, Acheson sat Sticker down and sent him a very clear message. It was delivered in diplomatic language. Of course, Acheson was a diplomat. He wasn't a bully. But he said, unfortunately, given the weight of public opinion in the United States and given the sentiment within the Congress, unless you immediately cease all military actions and move forthwith to begin meaningful negotiations with the Indonesians aimed toward the grant of immediate independence, we will have no choice but to suspend all economic aid to the Netherlands, all economic aid. This is one of the best examples, probably the best before the Suez Crisis of 1956, where the United States uses naked economic power to force a friendly European country to do something that it doesn't want to do. In fact, a famous political scientist once defined power, and I think it's a good definition, as the ability to get someone else to do something they don't want to do. Now, to me, that's as good a definition of power as we've got. The ability to make someone else do something they don't want to do. Well, the Dutch did not want to grant genuine independence to the Indonesians. And the road from March 31st, 1949 to the independence celebrations that I began my remarks with was a long and a rocky one. But 2 weeks after the meeting with Sticker, the Dutch enter into negotiations here in Indonesia with Indonesian Republican diplomats. Very quickly, by May 7th, after 3 weeks of hard negotiations, an agreement is initialed, the Rum-Van Rooyen Agreement, and as a result of that agreement, talks shortly open in the Netherlands, formal negotiations that ultimately lead to the transfer of sovereignty on December 27th of 1949. During the final stages of these negotiations, the man who was about to become the first U.S. ambassador here played a critical role in coming up with compromise solutions to several nagging problems. Given the thrust of American foreign policy in the post-war period, and I'll conclude here now, and certainly I'll be happy to entertain any questions or comments you might have. Perhaps the chief significance of the American support for Indonesian independence lies in its singularity. Its singularity. Admittedly, American support came rather late, as I've suggested, only after the Dutch had twice violated internationally sanctioned agreements. But the salient fact is that it did come. The United States did align itself with the national liberation movement against a friendly European imperial power. Significantly, at the same time, the United States was moving to oppose a similar struggle for independence in nearby Indochina, and was already considering plans to underwrite the French colonial rule in that embattled land. Are there lessons here for the contemporary world? Well, I think this case illustrates the problem of a major power trying to navigate cross-cutting and often conflicting interests. The United States had an interest in maintaining harmonious relations with its European allies. It also had an interest in pushing for the gradual evolution toward self-rule in the developing world. But forced to choose between those two conflicting interests for most of this period, the United States, not surprisingly, prized the priority of maintaining harmonious relations with Europe as more important than opening new relationships with newly emerging nations. Another, to me, fascinating lesson here is how do diplomats act when they're peering into an uncertain and unknowable future. Some periods are more fraught with change and hence with risk than other periods. And the years that immediately followed World War II was one of those problems. There was a lot of uncertainty. The European colonial order had been shaken to its core. It was going to be replaced inevitably at some point with independent nation states in what came to be called the Third World. But what would be the timing of that process? What kind of regimes would emerge? Would the United States find its interests compatible with the emergence of those regimes? And in pushing to facilitate America's adjustment to that inevitability, how fast should the pace be? And how much pressure should the United States place on its traditional European allies? This was all happening at a moment when time seemed to accelerate. There are moments in our history where time seems to move at an accelerated pace, and World War II certainly accelerated change throughout the developing world, especially here in Southeast Asia. The nationalist movements incubated for a long time prior to World War II, but World War II was a kind of hothouse in which those movements grew stronger, more insistent, more powerful, and less willing to settle for anything less than true, genuine, and immediate independence. How do you deal with a new reality which is very different from something that you're expecting? And finally, let me just make one point about the legacy here. At a basic and simple level, one could argue, and I'd like to make this argument as an American deeply sympathetic to Indonesia, that some really strong foundational bonds were forged here by the important role that the United States played in helping to bring about an independent Indonesia. Now, to be sure, problems emerge in the US-Indonesian relationship less than a decade after this period in which the United States champions Indonesian independence. And Sukarno emerges by, no later than the late 1950s, and certainly even more so in the mid-1960s, as a thorn in America's side, a mercurial leader who on one famous occasion said to the United States, "Go to hell with your aid," and helped orchestrate demonstrations, some of which turned violent, against US diplomatic facilities here in Indonesia. So yes, there have been rocky moments, but to take an example from American history, France played as important, if not more important, a role in American independence than the United States played in Indonesian independence. Do you think the United States remained grateful to France indefinitely for its selfless aid to the United States? Hardly. If anyone has seen or heard about the now famous Broadway play Hamilton, it revolves around the dispute among what Americans like to call our founding fathers about whether to lean toward Britain or lean toward France. And some of the same folks, like Alexander Hamilton himself, the first Secretary of the Treasury, very, very quickly turned on the French as George Washington's aid. He knew how critically important French aid had been to the United States. But a decade later, he had other priorities. And besides, the French Revolution had happened, it was a different regime, and gratitude doesn't really last long in international affairs. That said, I think there is a foundational bond between the United States and France, which dates back to the 1770s. And for all the ups and downs there have been in US-French relations, and I think we're seeing a down right now, I think that foundational bond matters. I think it endures. I think it's historically important. And I would like to think that over a comparably long period of time, that the foundational bonds forged between those Americans who genuinely worked hard to promote Indonesian independence will be remembered, will be celebrated, will be commemorated, will not be forgotten, and will help as we move forward into an uncertain future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor McMahon. Thank you for your interesting historical narrative of and sadness over our independence or post-colonialism period. Rather than me doing questions to you, I would allow probably the audience, because we only have about half an hour. Okay. Is anybody interested in asking questions? Okay, Pak Chris.
Good afternoon, Professor McMahon. We are here today commemorating the 70 years of Indonesia-United States relation. In my opinion, within the 70 years, the United States benefiting more than Indonesia. First, when the KMB signed, the US lobbied Indonesia to accept the term that the debt of the former East Indies colony SB to be taken over by Indonesia. This is the only case where a former colonial nation has to pay the debt of its colonial overlord. And then the second, when Indonesia became anti-communist in 1965, I think the United States got what we call durian runtuh, free you get free of charge Indonesia as an anti-communist nation, while in Vietnam, you need thousands of lives and billions of dollars. I just raised the two questions. Thank you.
Give me a quick summary of that?
Oh, I see. Thank you. The first was the United States. Don't forget that the United States have forced Indonesia to pay debts of the Dutch after the roundtable. And then the second is how lucky you are actually to get Indonesia to be anti-communist without being killed, like in Vietnam.
Yes, thank you for those two questions. With regard to the first, the debt question was one of the three most contentious issues during the roundtable conference. The Indonesians took what I think was a very reasonable position, that they should be forced to pay part of the cost of Dutch military actions against them. Cochran, a pragmatist who was seeking to avoid the conference breaking down on that issue, pressed the Indonesians to assume part of that debt. So your criticism of that is a reasonable one. It's well taken. But the Indonesians themselves chose to make that compromise because they believed that it was another means to the ultimate end of independence. With regard to the events of 1965, American officials thought they had received a diplomatic windfall with the overthrow of Sukarno without having to get directly involved themselves. It's interesting that American officials at the time don't seem to have paid as much attention to the significance of the developments in Indonesia as they probably should have. But the Lyndon Johnson administration was so deeply preoccupied with the military escalation in Vietnam that all eyes of top policymakers were focused on Vietnam. I mean, there's a distortion here because by any reasonable measure, and I don't think anyone in this audience would disagree with me, Indonesia is infinitely more important than Vietnam in strategic terms, in economic terms, in political terms, in geopolitical terms. But once you get involved in an issue such as Vietnam, a quagmire, and as a great power, your credibility is perceived to be on the line, that can prove to be distorting. And I think there was a lot of distortion at that time in terms of perceptions of what was happening in Southeast Asia.
Anybody else with questions? Oh, okay. Silakan, Pak. Introduce yourself.
I'm Spakio. I'm nobody. Sorry, my English is not that good, and I understand that you are good in Indonesian, so I prefer to ask in Indonesian, but I'll try. After your explanation, it's clear that the big role of the United States is only after the second politional action, the second class. That is after 48. Yes. Before it was not that big, that role. But after the transfer of sovereignty, Papua, Irian was not included in our sovereignty. I'm asking whether you have also studied the U.S. role in bringing Papua back to Indonesian sovereignty.
Yes, thank you. That's an important issue. I think I mentioned that there were three highly contentious issues at the Roundtable Conference in The Hague. The first questioner mentioned one, you've just mentioned the second, and yours was the most impossible to negotiate a solution to. So what Merle Cochran did is he did what a lot of pragmatic diplomats do when faced with an insoluble problem. And in the American idiom, he kicked the can down the road. He decided to postpone a resolution of this problem until the future. So he took it off the table by saying that after 1 year, the Indonesians and the Dutch should enter into bilateral negotiations to determine the future of the territory then known as West Irian by the Indonesians, and the Dutch continued to call West New Guinea. And of course, those negotiations quickly came to a standstill. And it wasn't until 1962, under pressure exerted personally by President John F. Kennedy, that a diplomatic resolution favorable to the Indonesians was finally negotiated in Northern Virginia, right outside Washington. Kennedy had decided that the Eisenhower administration had made a major mistake by not pressing the Dutch to finally relent on their control over West Irian. Kennedy wanted to court non-aligned countries like Indonesia, and he was hopeful that if the United States could play a productive role in finally resolving this contentious and highly emotional dispute, that he could usher in a new era of warm relations with Indonesia. It didn't work out as he intended, but certainly he removed that particular issue from the diplomatic docket. Yeah, there was no way that the Dutch and Indonesians were going to come to a meeting of the minds about the future of West Irian. The issue was too emotional on both sides.
Anyway, oh, okay, go ahead. Amelia? She's a historian.
Thank you so much, Professor McMahon. I really enjoy your talk. My question is about the shifting of support. In addition to the support from U.S. Congress, is there any other domestic pressure or support to the shifting of U.S. Foreign policy to Indonesia? You mentioned about public policy, public opinion in the U.S. Could you elaborate more on that? And then my second question is whether the shifting is part of U.S. foreign policy to Southeast Asia, given the fact of U.S.-Philippines special relation. Is it really part of a U.S. kind of like foreign policy framework to Southeast Asia in general? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. With regard to the first one, there are certain groups within the United States, within American civil society, within the media, that press the Truman administration. So some of the more prestigious newspapers in the United States, the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, the Washington Post, began to editorialize strongly against the Dutch and in favor of Indonesian independence. Aggregate public opinion, as measured in what were then still relatively primitive public opinion polls, indicated an upsurge of support among ordinary Americans for the Indonesian cause. Organized labor in the United States weighed in on the issue. Philip Murray, who was the head of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, which was a 6 million member organization at that time, wrote a blistering letter to Secretary of State George Marshall calling for the United States to press the Dutch to grant Indonesian independence. And African-American groups, civil rights groups in the United States, including the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also weighed in. Now, interestingly, Truman was a Democrat, and African-American groups and organized labor were important elements of the Democratic core constituency ever since Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. So those groups had particular influence on the policy orientation of a Democratic president. So it's hard to measure precisely that impact, but I think it was very significant. And it also points to the fact that the story of U.S. support for Indonesia is not just a government-to-government affair. There are elements within American civil society that were very sympathetic to the Indonesians, and those strands in American history, the more liberal strands of anti-colonialism, never really died, even though Roosevelt passed away and his anti-colonial policy temporarily didn't move forward after his death. But there were still progressive and liberal Americans and organized groups in American society who thought that anti-colonialism represented one of America's best and most important traditions and wanted to uphold that tradition. And so you see in the wake of the second police action an upsurge in this liberal anti-colonial support for self-determination and support for colonial nationalist movements. It's an interesting moment. It would have been much harder for such groups to weigh in on behalf of Vietnamese independence because of the leadership of the Vietnamese independence movement being predominantly communist and because of Ho Chi Minh's ties to the Comintern. Indonesia was a different case, and because it had proved its anti-communist credentials by suppressing the communist rebellion at Mediation, it made it easier for liberal and progressive and also moderate groups to support Indonesian independence. After all, the congressional resolution that I mentioned was a resolution from the other political party, from Truman's opposition. It was Republicans. Now, if you're familiar with American politics today, you know that the Republican Party has become overwhelmingly conservative ideologically. But in the wake of World War II, the Republican Party was more of a coalition that contained moderate and liberal elements as well as conservative elements. And it still had a progressive tradition reaching back to the 1920s and even earlier. There were lots of Democratic senators, I'm sure, who shared the sentiment of Owen Brewster, but were careful not to buck a president from their own party at that moment. That's what makes the political dimension of this really interesting. And I think anyone who's followed American politics lately has been forced to become sensitized to the role that politics plays in foreign policy decision-making.
Anybody from the student side, maybe? Oh, there's one. You're a student? You're a student. Okay.
Ini ya saya, Rin. Ini dari tadi saya either you don't see me or since the beginning I was the one who point my.
Theo first.
Yeah.
USINDO.
Sure.
The lights in our eyes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for your very comprehensive presentation and briefing us. My question is very short, actually. That in 1962, as you told just now when you answering a question from the floor, that President Kennedy put pressure on the Dutch to come to negotiation for completely the negotiation where Papua still be left when the 1949 negotiation concluded at the time. But then, after the Kennedy assassination in 1963, President Lyndon Johnson, changed his policy, not entertain Indonesia anymore, but trying to get away from Indonesia because he's the peak of the Cold War at the time. Had President Johnson not left Indonesia at the time, perhaps the history can be different afterward. It's not going to be perhaps, yeah, it is not. the coup, the communist coup, is not going to be in place at that time. Please, your observation about this.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And you're right, there is a shift in American foreign policy priorities toward what was then referred to as the Third World when Johnson replaces Kennedy as president. Kennedy had made one of the main priorities of his foreign policy an effort to court favor with non-aligned nations such as Indonesia, India, Ghana, and Egypt. Johnson was much less enamored with that policy. Johnson tended to be more transactional in his approach to foreign policy, and he was much less sympathetic to the idea of trying to court nations who often took positions that he thought were opposed to American interests. So, yes, had Kennedy lived, U.S. policy toward Indonesia might have played out in different ways. That said, the core emphasis of American policy toward Indonesia after the failed U.S. intervention in the Civil War of 1957-1958 was to build up the Indonesian military with generous U.S. military assistance, because U.S. officials, whether rightly or wrongly, calculated that by developing strong ties with the Indonesian military, which was viewed as predominantly anti-communist, the United States would be supporting a counterforce to a growing Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI. The single most determinative factor in shaping American policy toward Indonesia between 1955 and 1965 was fear. Fear on the part of the United States that the largest non-ruling communist party in the world, the PKI, would ultimately come to power in Indonesia and make common cause with the People's Republic of China and with the Soviet Union. Whether rightly or wrongly, that was the unanimous view of top American strategists, foreign policy officials, and defense planners. And so all American foreign policy decisions from 1955 until the coup of 1965 revolved around trying to undermine the Communist Party and trying to bolster the Indonesian military. Again, whether rightly or wrongly, after the 1965 coup, many American officials privately gloated that they had made the right bet, that the communists were suppressed at the hands of the Indonesian military, and now the military was in charge and it was going to pursue a friendly policy toward the United States and the West. So in my judgment, those are the dynamics that play out during the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations.
Thank you. I was given more time, so I'm looking for students. You or the other guy? The one with the shot? It's you? Okay. What is your name?
What?
Jake. Thank you, Professor McMahon, for your presentation. I'm from Gunadharma University. My question is very simple to you. What is U.S. role in the Dutch-Indonesian Roundtable Conference in The Hague, Netherlands? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The U.S. role is, it's not a formal role, it's an informal role, but it's nonetheless a very important one. because when the negotiations reached an impasse on several contentious issues, the two sides looked to the U.S. diplomat Admiral Cochran to offer advice and compromise proposals. And he did that with regard to the three most contentious issues: the status of Papua, what was then called West Irian, the debt question, both of which have been mentioned, and the third issue was the federated structure of what was going to be called the United States of Indonesia. On each of these three issues, an impasse threatened. Neither side was willing to give. Each of these issues was highly emotional. Cochran stepped in with compromise proposals which allowed the negotiations to go forth. So I would say, without the informal role of Cochran, without his advice and his set of recommendations, the negotiations could easily have broken down. And had they broken down, probably military action would have ensued.
Thank you. My name is Kim, and I'm also a university student. So I've heard a lot of talks about Papua in the Roundtable Conference, but there is actually one island that is being rarely talked about, which is the island of Timor. Since it's actually divided too. There's a Dutch area and the one is Portuguese. Now the Roundtable deal is actually to all Dutch territories to be given, but Sukarno did not really uphold to that. He actually sees that East Timor is also part of Indonesia. Not only that, he also sees that even Malaysia is part of Indonesia, and some other of our also more revolutionary founding fathers like Tan Malaka even mentioned that Philippines is supposed to be part of Indonesia. He mentions it as Northern Indonesia more than he mentions it as Philippines. So my question is that how the United States of America decides that, okay, this territory we can support Sukarno to claim this territory, and other than that, it's like an overstretch. Like we cannot go that far in dealing with Indonesian independence. And if you don't mind, I also have a second question, which is that since you mentioned this as a foundation of our relationship between the two countries, my question would be that how did American people or American government view this foundation of our relationship? Is it truly something significant for the American people and the American government, or is it simply just like what you said, another French of the United States? I mean, like, sure, they helped us, but now what? So that would be my question.
Well, thank you for both of those questions. Let me try and respond to the second one first. I would say for most ordinary Americans then and today, they couldn't locate Indonesia on a map. They don't read about Indonesia. They don't know much about Indonesia. Not much is taught in American schools, and the press doesn't report on Indonesia. So for one of the world's largest countries to be relatively understudied and not much discussed is sad, but it's true. Even most American university history departments and political science departments, even the large ones, when they teach Asia, they tend to concentrate on China and Japan. And not only Indonesia, but the whole Southeast Asian region tends not to be covered in the curricula of even some of the best American universities. So, you know, that's sad, but that's true. You can't cover the whole world, most universities would say, so they make choices. And if you're a small university and you only have the budget to hire one Asian historian, most likely you want one to teach China or Japan. And Ohio State is one of the 3 biggest history departments in the United States, and we've got 5 Asian historians. but we don't have a single historian who specializes in any part of Southeast Asia. So as far as ordinary Americans are concerned, most would not have paid close attention to developments in Indonesia. During some of the critical events that I mentioned toward the end of my remarks, the second Dutch police action, the Brewster Amendment, the signing of NATO, the threat to withhold appropriations to the Netherlands, all of a sudden that was a first-page newspaper story. So anyone who avidly read the press would have followed the Indonesian dispute during that time. But after that time, it faded from public view. During the Sukarno era, there are moments when Indonesia gets a lot of attention. The Afro-Asian Conference at Bandung in 1955, some of Sukarno's inflammatory anti-American speeches are well covered, and some members of Congress, make some equally inflammatory statements about the Indonesian leader. But if you were to quiz even some of the best educated Americans about the US role in Indonesian independence, or even when Indonesia became independent, or even who was the colonial overlord in Indonesia before independence, I think you'd be greeted by a lot of blank stares. When Americans think of Southeast Asia, because of our long and sorry history with the Vietnam War, they tend to fixate on Vietnam and not Indonesia.
Okay, there are students from Mustafa, right? Anybody has any questions? Yeah, okay.
Oh, I didn't answer his first question.
Huh?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't answer your first question. With regard to the territorial issues, I think the basic rule of thumb that the Americans and the Indonesians wanted to follow was that any territory that the Dutch claimed control over as part of the East Indies should naturally be inherited by an independent Indonesian state. And that's why the issue of Papua or West Irian is such an emotional one. As far as I know, the territory of Timor doesn't really come up at the roundtable negotiations, but it's also possible that I just missed it. It certainly was not a major issue. And the Dutch argument about Papua revolved around their paternalistic concern for these less developed, what they would have called primitive peoples who were in need of Dutch oversight until they reached a higher level of civilization. So it was paternalistic and it was patronizing, but it was also a way that the Dutch could hang on to a piece of territory in Southeast Asia, which was very important to their own sense of national pride and prestige. That's why an area that doesn't have a great deal of strategic or commercial value became such an emotional touchstone for the Dutch.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Andika Projo. I want to ask about your opinion on the relation of Indonesia and United States during the Sukarno. Which had a deteriorated almost breaking through under the Sukarno, improved dramatically, particularly in economic realm. That how that the United States gained the trust when Sukarno suspiciously that say American harbored imperialists designed to exploit it, not dominate Indonesia. Thank you.
Is he referring to the 1940s?
It wasn't quite clear.
I mean, if you're referring to the independence struggle period that I've focused on, Sukarno is able to come to look favorably on the Americans because he accepted the diplomatic strategy that had been decided upon very early in the Indonesian independence movement. During those years, Sukarno acts more as a figurehead and a symbol than he does as a leader concerned with day-to-day affairs. In that regard, figures who are less remembered today, like Sultan Syahrir and Emir Sharafuddin, play a very important role, and then later Muhammad Hatta, when he becomes prime minister in 1948. Sukarno doesn't meet frequently with Americans. Partly that's an issue of proximity. He's not in Jakarta, and that's where the American diplomats are headquartered. He does on occasion meet with American diplomats, and those who meet with him have a generally favorable view. Of course, he has a reputation as a fiery orator. He has a reputation for having a somewhat mercurial temperament and personality, but Americans see him as part of a leadership team, and that team is seen as cosmopolitan, pro-Western, moderate, and anti-communist. And Americans view Sukarno in that way as well. And they continue to do so until the mid-1950s. He has a very warm meeting with President Eisenhower in Washington in 1955. And Eisenhower believes that US-Indonesian relations are really moving in a very positive direction. But shortly after that, Sukarno travels to China and the Soviet Union, and he heaps praise upon both of those communist powers. And then in Indonesian national elections in 1955, the PKI demonstrates its strength, and Americans begin to become more suspicious of Sukarno, seeing him as someone who's abetting the rise and the power of the PKI. They're not sure whether he's using them for his own purposes or whether he actually is supportive of key elements of their agenda. And experts debate that issue back and forth for a decade or so and never come to any firm conclusions. But they decide that whether Sukarno is a closet communist or a nationalist who is captivated by the power of the Communist Party, they think it's a bad thing. And they calculate that there's a kind of a triangle in Indonesian politics. At the head of the triangle is Sukarno, the president, and the unquestioned national leader. And at the other points of the triangle are the Indonesian armed forces, who are seen as largely pro-Western and anti-communist, and the PKI itself. And much of American debates about what policies to pursue in Indonesia from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s revolve around trying to figure out that triangular relationship and how it's going to play out. Most expected that at some point in the future, they didn't know when and they didn't know how, there would be a clash. And the communists would clash with the Indonesian military. And they wanted to do everything they could to help ensure that if and when that clash came, the Indonesian military would come out on top, the communists would be suppressed, and the United States would find a more comfortable partner.
We still have more time. If anybody else wants to pose a question, okay, this one. A student? You're a student? No, are you faculty? You're a faculty, okay.
Okay, actually I have two questions. Well, I think I follow up, I think the previous questions that United States basically face dilemma between siding with its allies or supporting its the values of self-determination. And my question is the United, and it seems from your explanation that initially, or it takes so long that the United States prefer the first option rather than the second. So my question will be that, is it something or policy that United States then regret, and then it becomes a lesson learned? Because I see that as a major power, I think until now United States will face the same things, right? Between siding with its allies or promoting self-determination, and that makes many criticize United States as double standards. So what do you think? Is it something that is regretted by the United States, or is it something that is, well, it's a successful example that we should take gradual position to certain issues by siding with its allies and eventually prefer the second, for example. And my second question, I mean, there are always two sides of stories in a dispute, and your explanation tell about American contribution or role in Indonesia's independence, but from the Indonesian side, I believe Indonesia also play a agency role in Indonesia's independence, and even we usually do not say that the independence is granted, but it is something that we fight for. And you also mentioned that Indonesia also make a considerable diplomacy to fight for its independence. Could you give me examples of Indonesia's diplomacy to United States to gain support for its independence? Thank you.
Yeah, so those are very important and well articulated questions. If I could answer the second one first, the United States did not grant Indonesia independence. It didn't have that power. It supported Indonesian independence by pressuring the Dutch, by using the financial leverage that it had. If Indonesian military forces had not fought the Dutch to a standstill after the second police action, Indonesia would not have been in a strong enough position to make concessions and to realize the end goal of its diplomatic strategy. Now, the Indonesians consciously chose to pursue a strategy of diplomacy rather than armed struggle as a means to achieve independence. And it was not without dissidents within the movement. There were some, especially the more leftist elements and the communists, who didn't want to court the West, who were determined to win independence through armed struggle and hated the idea of making important concessions to the Dutch. And perhaps their viewpoint deserves more credit than historians often give it. But those who were in control of the Republican government made different calculations. They calculated that to pursue armed struggle would be very costly and it would be protracted, and it would hurt Indonesia economically, and it would cost the lives of many soldiers and innocent civilians. I mean, just by way of perspective, Indochina chose that path, and it succeeded. Vietnam succeeded. It became independent through armed struggle. But what was the toll? Historians estimate that no fewer than 3 million Vietnamese died during that war. Another million or so died in Cambodia. Hundreds of thousands died in Laos, and it took 30 years. If you take a broad view of history, I think it's easy to credit Indonesian leadership for wisdom and statesmanship. They chose to avoid that path of armed struggle, violence, massive death, and economic destruction because they thought if they compromised, emphasized their moderation, reached out to the West, that they would have a higher likelihood of achieving independence at a more reasonable cost. So it was a conscious calculation. So when the Americans choose or are forced to support the Indonesians in 1949, one can see that as the culmination of an Indonesian strategy that hinged on diplomatic activity and that hinged on courting support from the Western superpower. So it's really a fruition of Indonesian decisions and strategy, and you see a confluence between American interests and Indonesian interests. Now, your first question, just quickly remind me your first question again. Just.
I see that United States. Sorry. I see that in this case, United States facing a dilemma between siding with its allies or supporting the values of self-determination. Do you think it is something that is because I see that United States takes too long for United States to eventually prefer the second and take the first, siding with the Dutch first. Do you think it is something that is regretted among the American policymakers, and so it is a lesson learned for now? Or do you think that, okay, it is a successful case that supporting the allies will be okay too? Because as a major power, I believe until now United States also face many dilemmas regarding these two positions. Thank you.
Yes, no, those are important issues. I think some American officials regretted it. They regretted it at the time. There was a difference of opinion, a sharp difference of opinion between Asian desk officers in the State Department and European desk officers. The Asian desk officers tended to be more sympathetic to what they saw as a transforming dynamic in world affairs of emergent nations in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the developing world. And they pushed their superiors to come to that realization. And it took a long time. So the State Department is a diverse institution, as some of the Ad-America people here, I think, would agree. There are differences of opinion within the State Department then as now, and there were debates, there was contentiousness. Which way do we go? Do we support the Indonesians? Do we support the Dutch? So, yes, what happens is a debate that begins in the wake of World War II, is carried on until 1949, and ultimately those who are supportive of Indonesia, the more Asian oriented specialists in the State Department, win the day. Now, whether those who were very favorable to the Dutch come to think we made a mistake here, we should not have been so supportive of the Dutch, I don't know. I've never seen any memoirs or policy papers that indicated that they had those second thoughts or regrets. They probably should have. With regard to the issue of the dilemma, do you support your allies, even if you think your allies are making foolish mistakes? Or do you break with your allies? This comes up during the Suez Crisis in 1956, where the United States breaks with three of its most important allies, Britain, France, and Israel, and instead sides with Egypt, a country that had been hostile to the United States, because President Eisenhower believes that the use of force against Egypt by three of America's closest allies was unjustifiable, and inconsistent with American principles. And that creates a crisis within the Western alliance. But America does make that decision. Later on, with regard to Portuguese territories in Africa in the 1970s, I think the United States follows a retrograde policy. It chooses to support Portugal because of the importance of U.S. military bases, primarily in the Azores, against the emerging nationalist forces in Angola and other Portuguese colonial territories. And then you move forward to South Africa. More recently, in the 1980s and 1990s, it was very, very late in the game before the United States finally decided to break with its South African ally, the white minority regime, and instead support the forces of the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela. I think it came, disgracefully late in the game. But as with the Indonesian case, there were civil society pressures and pressures in Congress. This wasn't a clear-cut issue, and there was a very, very lively debate about which side to come down on in the struggle between the ANC and South Africa. But if you look at the period from World War II really right up to the present, and certainly throughout the colonial era, there are a number of flashpoints comparable to Indonesia, where the United States finds itself impaled on the horns of a dilemma. Which way do we turn when we have competing national interests and conflicting policy goals? Those are tough choices. In the end, the Indonesian case resolved itself somewhat easily because American interests in Indonesia wound up aligning with American values. And when your values are in alignment with your interests, it makes policymakers' decisions much easier. It's tougher and more common when interests point in one direction, think of Saudi Arabia today, and values point in a very different direction. Thanks.
Too bad our time is up. I mean, we're almost closing here, even though I missed a question for you, but nonetheless, thank you for all your questions. This was definitely a unique opportunity for us to listen to a very famous historian, so we can learn a bit about our past, our pain of being third world, and still ongoing pain that we are ongoing now. And hopefully things will evolve in a rosy manner. Hopefully Indonesia will become something that you will be proud of by next election, hopefully. And so thanks again to America, Jed, and USINDO for having, and the US Embassy for having this moment to celebrate its 70th anniversary of US-Indonesia relations. Hopefully we don't have hiccups anymore, and we get lucky. Usually pivotal moments come when you get unlucky, okay? So when we are lucky, hopefully we still be abiding by the same values, and so we don't have disputes to resolve. And we live happily ever after in the East Asia and the Pacific. Hopefully things will be cool for us here and with the help of the US. Thank you so much. And a big applause for Professor McMahon.
Okay, before I close the event, I would like to invite Professor McMahon and also Ibu Susi and also Bapak Jati Dornberg and also Mr. Theo L. Sambuaga, Indonesia, co-chair of USINDO. Please come up on stage. We're gonna have a photo session together. And to all of you guys, thank you all for coming today to America. I hope you guys have a great day.